Samantha is betrayed and captured by a group of people she once trusted, including Cade, who she considered an ally. She is mercilessly dragged towards a dark hole, ready to be thrown in. Why do Cade and the others treat Samantha this way? What do they want, and can Samantha escape this terrible fate? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter in the safe house. It had to be beyond the next horizon. That's what I kept telling myself as my feet propelled me forward, continuing to push as far as I could see. It was easier to see now, considering the darkest part of the night had passed and rays of the sun were slowly beginning to rise. My path no longer was dark and malicious, scattered with varying things I could trip over, but illuminated in the soft glow of the morning sun. I expected the morning to give me renewed energy, or at the very least a newfound sense of direction. However, it gave me nothing but light. I was beyond grateful I could now see, but everything else was beginning to wear. My body ached, my lungs begged for air, my feet were numb, and my broken wrist was throbbing in time with my heart. I desperately wanted to stop and give my body a rest, but I wouldn't allow it. Not until I found the safe house. So I trudged on. I tried to ignore the protests from each of my limbs and distract myself with thoughts of freedom and what it would be like outside the country. The war would be raging, but that meant there would be towns where the wolves weren't in charge. I'd find one of those towns. I'd find a place to live, people I could trust. I'd enlist the help of others to go back and rescue my mother and Will. We'd all live together, free from the reign of those who thought they were above us. I smiled to myself at the daydream, letting that hope propel me forward. The thing that excited me most was that it wasn't just a daydream anymore. It was becoming a reality. All I had to do was keep moving and I would make it come true. My smile widened as I suddenly realized that I had the power to do anything I wanted. There was no longer anyone forcing me to behave a certain way because of who I was perceived to be. It was mid-morning now, and nothing around me had changed. Not the scenery, not my aching body, but not my determination either. By this point, I was once again in desperate need of food and water. I paused momentarily, ducking behind a particularly thick tree. I leaned on the trunk, giving myself a moment of relief as I dug through my backpack. I'd been careful with my supplies, so there were still quite a few things to pick from. In the end, I grabbed a bottle of water and can of diced chicken. I would need the protein to keep my body moving. Once I had the items in my hands, I packed up and began moving again. If I stayed leaning against that tree any longer, I was afraid I wouldn't get back up. So I continued on, but this time with the companionship of the chicken. The sun was directly above my head now, and I began shedding my various layers. Cade's jacket was the first to go, followed by my own that I'd slipped on halfway through the night. They each went into my bag as I was sure I'd need them again later. I was debating taking off my extra pair of socks when I came upon a small clearing. I stopped in my tracks as I noticed the trees thinning to reveal a small white stone building. I stared at the building in shock. Was I imagining it? I began to move forward again, but movement inside the building sent me to the ground. I crouched in place, making sure I was concealed by the brush. As I sat on the ground, I listened to a foreign voice. It came from inside the house and I was only able to hear the sound because of a window that stood ajar. The voice was deep, however, so I deemed it to belong to a man. I concentrated harder as I tried to pick out what the voice was saying. However, I soon realized I didn't have the hearing of a werewolf. I sighed before adjusting my weight to lift myself slowly up. My eyes scanned the house. Falling on the window, I heard the noise coming from. I watched one figure pace back and forth, passing the window every few seconds. His frame was tense and I noticed his hands were balled into fists, swinging by his side in time with his stride. He was the only one I saw for a few moments until a smaller figure sat at the window. I saw long dirty blonde hair falling behind the figure's shoulders, falling limply against the back. This one was silent, but I figured it was a woman. All of my senses were now focused on that small house and the two people inside. The house was sitting in the center of the clearing, the nearest tree several yards away. It hid nothing and almost seemed to beckon me inside. However, my feet wouldn't move. Though I knew this was obviously a safe house, I wasn't intent on barreling inside until I knew I could trust whoever was there. I was ripped out of my intense stare when I heard something cracking behind me. I whipped my head around only to come face to face with a man. He had light brown hair and a tall frame, long arms wrapping something close to his body. When his gaze landed upon me, he let his arms fall, and I watched as he dropped the various small sticks and chunks of wood that he'd been holding. The wood clattered against each other as it all fell to the ground, sending the noise ringing through the silent trees. I jumped up from my spot and prepared myself to run, but the man quickly put himself in front of me. "Samantha," he breathed, almost in disbelief. I furrowed my eyebrows. "Who are you?" My voice was hoarse, but it came out strong and demanding. "I'm Zane." He moved a foot forward, but I quickly flinched back. "I'm not going to hurt you. How do you know my name?" "Margaret told us you would be coming through here," he spoke slowly, watching me carefully. His words registered in my mind and I instantly relaxed. He noticed this and gave a weak smile. "Why don't we head inside? We've been waiting for you." I looked back warily at the house but reluctantly nodded. If Zane was with Margaret, I could trust him. Zane started moving, gesturing for me to follow. He walked slowly out of the brush and towards the cement building, whistling loudly as we approached. The man and woman inside immediately looked out the window, their gazes landing on me. I tried to look tall and strong, but my weakened body only came across as tired and dead. The woman disappeared from the view of the window and came out the side of the building, running towards Zane and I. I stopped in my tracks, watching as she approached me. When she noticed I had stopped, she put her hands up much like Zane had done earlier. "I'm Talia, Zane's sister. Can I help you inside?" Her voice was sweet and welcoming. I didn't notice it at first, but she began walking forward again and reached for my bag. All at once I relaxed. I let her take my backpack and watched as she slid it over her shoulder before putting her arm underneath mine. She started walking forward, taking my weight with her. I leaned on her fully, grateful for the help. The three of us walked to the side of the building and through a small wooden door. Once inside, the other man looked me over while walking quickly to Zane. I watched him carefully, though not as warily as before. He was taller than Zane, but not much broader. His skin reminded me of chocolate, but his eyes were golden, seeming to pierce through my exterior. If he had hair, it was clipped short enough so that it would not be seen. He nodded slightly in my direction before turning to Zane, whispering something. I tried to catch what he was saying, but before I could listen in, Talia was speaking to me. "The house doesn't have any furniture." She gestured to the barren one-roomed home. "So you'll just have to settle for the ground." She led me to a corner of the room, helping me slide lightly against the stone walls. Now with a full view of the room, I noticed how small it was. It could hardly be called a safe house, as it was more of a single bedroom with a smaller room in the back. "No bathroom either," Talia started. "You just have to go outside. It's not glamorous, but it'll do," she laughed. Talia put my backpack down next to my feet before sitting next to me. I smiled lightly at her, though my gaze followed the two men who retreated into the back room. She noticed my gaze and laughed lightly. "Enzo is a bit on edge. I'm sure he just wants to make sure you're who you say you are," she spoke lightly. I nodded in response, leaning my head against the wall. This was the first time I'd sat down since yesterday, and my body was grateful for the relief. Talia suddenly chuckled. "You know, we didn't really expect you until tonight or tomorrow. You must have been hauling ass." I smiled at her again, taking a bit of pride at my hard work. It had paid off. "Thanks." I didn't really stop. Actually, I shifted my weight to look outside the window and the sun overhead. "I don't think I'll be staying too long here either." Talia's eyes widened. I now noticed her baby-like features, morphing her face into a sweet and innocent expression. The more I looked at her, the more I saw the resemblance between her and Zane. "Seriously. But you've got to be exhausted." I closed my eyes for a moment. "I am. But I have to keep moving. At least stay for a few hours. We got some wood to start a fire tonight, so it will be warm inside. Take a rest and eat a real meal. Your body will thank you for it." "She's right, you know." Zane's voice met my ears. I opened my eyes to watch the two men come out of the back room. They looked at Talia and I, Zane folding his arms across his chest. I started to protest, but he held up his hand. "Just rest for a little bit and see how you feel. If you still want to go, fine. But trust me, you need the rest." I slowly nodded, taking the three of them in. I shifted my body weight, suddenly slightly uncomfortable. My mind told me they were only helping, but my heart didn't like the fact they were trying to keep me here. Zane noticed my sudden unease and raised his arms. Look, you do you. We're not forcing you to stay. But you should know you won't make it much further without a proper rest. I slowly nodded. He was right after all, and we all knew it. He smiled and walked to the opposite end of the room, gesturing to the other man while he did so. This is Enzo, by the way. I smiled in his direction and he nodded at me. Good to have you. Sorry about earlier, we never can be too careful. It's fine, I understand. The two men sat down across from each other, and now each of us was leaning against a wall. It made the house seem even smaller if possible. I closed my eyes again, trying to calm my nerves. These people were here to help. They were humans. The good guys. There was no reason I should be afraid of them. Chapter 14 Sunset. I awoke what felt like not much longer. But when I looked outside, I realized I had fallen asleep for a few hours. The sun well into its descent, leaving shadows in its wake. When I saw this, I jolted upright and looked around. Zane and Talia were in the middle of the room, organizing wood around a roaring fire. At my sudden movement, they both glanced in my direction. Zane spoke up. Glad to see you're awake. Enzo's skinning some rabbits right now. When he's done and Talia cooks it, we'll have some food. I looked at the pair in front of me. They were clearly at ease, their backs to me and the door. It set me at ease as well, knowing they weren't afraid. Thanks, I started, my mind still recovering from sleep. How are you feeling? Talia asked. I smiled. Better. I needed sleep, you were right. She's always right, Zane taunted. Talia shot him a glance. I am, and you better not forget that. The two laughed. A pain suddenly shot through my heart as I remembered my own family, especially Will. My mind threatened to take me to the possibilities of his fate alone with James, but I was pulled from my thoughts as the door suddenly opened, revealing Enzo. He carried two rabbits, though you could hardly tell that's what they were anymore. All the skin was ripped away, revealing only the muscle and tissues underneath. His bloodied hands held them up proudly. Talia shot up from her position and greeted Enzo, taking the two animals by a leg. She returned to the fire and sat with her back to me once more. Enzo wiped his hands a couple times on his jeans, red streaks leaving their mark in the blue denim. He noticed me watching and smiled. Have you ever eaten wild animal? I smiled, though I'm sure came out as more of a grimace. No, don't have a lot of experience with blood and guts. He laughed, a loud and booming noise. It's messy business, that's for sure. As he was speaking, he came and sat next to me, though I noticed he stayed a good distance away. How are you feeling? I opened my mouth, but Zane cut me off. She said she's fine and Talia's always right. Enzo raised his eyebrow at me and I laughed. I really did need sleep. He nodded his head, bringing a knee up to rest his elbow on. You only got a few hours, you might want to think about getting more. Maybe, I mused. I thought about his proposition, glancing again to the window. The sun was dangerously low, and if it wasn't for the rabbit, I knew I'd be gone already. I reached for my backpack while I thought, pulling out Cade's jacket. It was already getting cooler. How'd you fare last night with the cold? Zane piped in, crawling to sit next to Enzo against the wall. Talia listened in, though she continued to focus on the rabbits. Well, I have 2 jackets and extra socks, so I did fine. I kept moving and I think that's what helped the most. You could be a world-class explorer, Zane laughed. Are you ever going to stop moving? Only when I get to freedom. Did you tell anyone you were leaving? Enzo suddenly asked. No, not really, I slowly answered, thinking of my mother. But I'm sure some people have figured it out. Like who? I paused. I already made the decision while walking yesterday that I wasn't going to speak of Samuel again. He was in the past. If I kept moving, he'd stay there. My boss, Remy. Enzo stared at me, expecting more, but Zane smiled. I've heard of him, he's a good guy. Tried to petition to make the trip once. He's pretty great, I paused. Actually, hang on. I suddenly remembered the plethora of supplies I had because of him. I've got some extra water, I think. It's the least I can do after you guys helped me. As I talked, I reached into my bag and pulled out 2 bottles of water. Zane raised his eyebrows while Enzo furrowed his, an unreadable look appearing on his features. How much do you have? Enzo questioned. Enough, I said vaguely. Please take them. I rolled the waters towards the 2 of them, watching the dirt and dust kick up as they went. Enzo picked his up while Zane tossed his towards Talia. Well, if you have enough supplies, I don't see why you're so bent on leaving already, Talia suddenly piped in, catching the water. I laughed lightly. I don't exactly want to get caught. If I hadn't have been looking at Enzo, I would have missed his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second. I quickly added an afterthought. And the sooner I get there the better. Once again, I think Talia's right, Zane sang. I smiled as the two of them exchanged shocked faces. Wow, that's 2 in one day for me. You better go with my intuition, Samantha, she laughed. I continued to smile but stayed silent. Enzo was watching me now, and I couldn't measure what he was thinking or why his demeanor had suddenly changed. What are all of you doing out here anyway? I looked to each one of them, my gaze lingering on Enzo for a moment longer. The wolves killed our family when we were young. Margaret took us in, Talia spoke. She looked to Zane, who nodded. We've never really lived in town, mostly just stayed in the outskirts, he finished. It suits us. I'm sorry about that, I told them, though I was slightly distracted. I looked to Enzo, awaiting his answer. The brother and sister noticed my gaze and followed it until all eyes were resting on the large man. He sighed. We've all got a reason to be out here, Samantha. Without waiting for a response, he quickly got up and walked to the fire. I think the rabbit's done. Talia jumped lightly, moving her hand away from the fire. After checking the meat, she nodded in Enzo's direction and gestured for the rest of us to come and grab a portion of the meal. The food was divided among us and we each sat in our own part of the room, eating quietly. Enzo's comments seemed to finalize any conversation we hoped to have. I was grateful for the silence though, as it allowed me to try and figure out the individuals before me. Zane and Talia seemed harmless enough, but Enzo was beginning to put me on edge. I had just finished my last bite of the gamey meat when Talia stood and walked to the back room. She came back holding a variety of soft material in her hands, placing them on the ground next to the fire. Listen, Samantha, she started. You can do what you want, we aren't forcing you to do anything. But we've got a fire, blankets, and a roof over your head. You should really stay here for the night. I widened my eyes at her forwardness but didn't get the time to let the shock sink in. Zane was right behind her. Not to mention good company. The woods are lonely, he smiled, gesturing to each of them. As they both spoke, unease crept into my heart. Something wasn't settling right in my stomach, and it wasn't the rabbit. I didn't know how rebellions, safe houses, or refugees normally worked, but I was sure it was a general principle to keep moving away from danger. If that was the case, why would they want me to stay? A small and uncomfortable silence stretched between us as the three of them awaited my answer. I glanced warily at the setting sun, which was now starting to disappear on the horizon. Trees were towering shadows once more, and the ground was already growing more and more difficult to see. This house is a good place to hide, Enzo finished. And that was it. That was what told me something was definitely wrong. I smiled, shrugging. I guess you guys are right. I think I'm going to stay for the night. I am exhausted, I yawned for good measure. Only I'm not sure I want your company, Zane. He dropped his jaw and I laughed loudly, the others following suit. Then suddenly Talia clasped her hands together, beaming. She walked forward and grabbed one of the cotton blankets, dropping it lightly in my lap. I grinned up at her, hugging the blanket closely. Thanks, I told her. I watched the men as Tahila continued speaking, rambling on and on about what a great decision this was. Meanwhile, Zane and Enzo exchanged a small look, Enzo's shoulders finally relaxing. Talia noticed me looking at them, and must have noticed my unease as well. Before she could bring this to the attention of the others, I quickly pulled her in close. Can I sleep in the back room though? I let her follow my gaze to the men in back, my eyes growing wide. She tilted her head in understanding, a warm smile crawling across her features. Of course. There's even a door for some privacy. A flame flickered within my chest as Talia walked back to Zane and Enzo. I quickly gathered up my things, dragging my backpack across the room. The two guys looked at me questioningly, but Talia quickly hushed any complaints they would make. I paused outside the entryway, halfway turning to them. The three were huddled by the fire, Talia clutching Zane's arm and Enzo standing with his legs apart. On the surface, they looked like anything you'd expect. But I knew better than to stop looking at the surface. I smiled warmly. Thanks again, guys. I really needed this. Zane brought his hand up to his neck, embarrassed. Don't get all mushy, Samantha. It's only our job. Laughing lightly, I turned and walked into the small room, leaving the three of them behind forever. As my back turned to them, my expression dimmed. I quickly scanned the new dark room, my eyes immediately landing on the open window I'd seen from the outside of the house. Thought it was small, it provided a small glimmer of light, just enough to shine the way outside. Every instinct in my body told me to run right then and there. I fought desperately against the urge, knowing it would only result in the three of them chasing me. Instead, I quietly shut the door and spread the blanket across the ground. Kneeling down on it, I pulled out my other jacket and slipped it over my head. Now that I was away from the fire, I could already feel the cold setting in. I lay down on the blanket, my back to the window. My eyes were trained on the door, watching the shadows walk around in the other room. The firelight danced and flickered underneath the door, adding to the feeling of anticipation that was now rooted in my gut. I kept my eyes wide open, no sleep coming anywhere close to my consciousness. Just as I'd expected, I soon heard footsteps approaching my door. I quickly relaxed my body and closed my eyes, letting my hair fall over my face. I was able to peek through the strands and my eyelashes as the door cracked open, revealing a slightly distraught Talia. I pretended to awake at the sound and light, shifting and moving my hair away from my face. I smiled up at her as she wrapped her hands around the door, halfway letting herself in the room. Sorry to disturb you, but I just wanted to make sure you're all right to stay back here. Can get awfully cold. I lifted my body up to a sitting position, watching her carefully. Thanks, Talia. I just don't have great experiences with trusting men. I'm really more comfortable sleeping with a door in between me and them. I smiled. Then I looked down. Sorry. Oh no, you don't have to be sorry, she practically squealed. I can only imagine. All right, I'm going to let you sleep now. Just know you're welcome out there if you want. With that, she retreated from the doorway, leaving me in darkness once more. I let out a sigh of relief. This was an awful, crazy, and dangerous plan that I'd formed moments ago. But so far it seemed to be working. Play on the sympathy of Talia. Joke with Zane. Appease Enzo. Show vulnerability. Then escape. I laid in my position on the floor for what felt like hours. My ears strained to hear any noise coming from the other side of the door, and eventually there was none. I first had to endure soft mumblings and a dying fire, but soon enough it seemed as if the three of them had gone to sleep. However, I waited a while longer after this happened just to be safe. When I couldn't stand it any longer, I slowly raised myself off the ground. I rolled the blanket up and stuffed it into my backpack, muffling the zipper with my sleeves. After each movement, I paused and listened for signs of disturbance from the others. As I worked, my breathing quickened as I felt the blood rush to my head. My heartbeat was soon the only thing I could hear, and that's when I decided to slip through the window. The window was small, so I had to take it one step at a time. I carefully dropped my backpack outside the opening, letting it fall quietly on soft summer grass. I looked behind me one last time, watching now for movement. When none came, I slipped both of my legs through the ledge, my feet falling directly next to my backpack. My torso and arms followed suit as my body bent to avoid the edges. Once I was fully rooted to the ground, I ran and I didn't stop. The only thoughts ringing through my mind were those of escape and vigilance. I couldn't go crashing through the trees no matter how much I wanted to. I had to remain quiet, yet not allow that to inhibit my speed. I had to move in the right direction, though I didn't even know where that was. Needless to say, it was not an easy task. Soon enough, multiple leaves and twigs were snapping underneath me. I cursed at myself for not being more graceful or trained, but I didn't allow myself to stop. Instead, I kept whipping my head backward, my gaze searching for any sign of someone following me. However, it wasn't movement behind me that made me stop. It was movement coming from straight ahead. Chapter 15 Guns. My mind didn't fully understand the noises until I saw a dark figure running straight for me. Panic thoughts started coursing through me as it registered who it was barreling in my direction. Enzo. Without thinking, I flew over a fallen tree trunk and dove to my right, taking myself out of his line of vision. I dared a glance behind me and I caught Enzo just as he tripped over the hidden wood. My feet propelled me faster along the forest floor. I was no longer thinking about my movements but allowing my body to take control. Somehow it knew what to do. Before long I heard Enzo shouting, followed by a few others. Somewhere in my mind it registered that he'd probably called for backup. That meant that soon enough I would have the other two running after me, plus whoever else was in on this ordeal. That is if they weren't already hiding in the woods like Enzo had done. My feet continued to fly as I tried to create more distance between myself and the others. I knew they were gaining on me, but I wouldn't stop. I couldn't. I couldn't allow myself to be held captive by them and risk my freedom. Though these people were human, I was slowly coming to realize that the fact meant nothing. I trusted Margaret and Cade, and because of that, I had 3 people chasing me through a forest. As I ran, a path stretched out before me. I made a split-second decision and ignored it, diving to the right and further into the trees. They seemed to thicken with every footstep I made, making it harder and harder to push past the leaves and fallen limbs. I didn't let this deter me. I would outrun them or die trying. As I jumped another log, I dared a glance behind me. When I did this, though, my feet flew out from underneath me as they were snatched by a foreign object. I flailed desperately, kicking at anything I could land my foot on. My feet met the soft exterior of skin, telling my mind that it was a person who had pulled me to the ground. I opened my mouth to let out a scream, but a hand was quickly placed upon it. Both of my hands flew to rip off the muzzle, but before I could do any damage they were pinned behind my back. I was now laying on the ground, pinned up against whoever was holding me. I continued to struggle, refusing to acknowledge the fact that I'd been caught. It couldn't happen. Not when I'd come so close. Tears betrayed me as they fell rapidly from my eyes. Despite the restraint, I screamed and struggled, pulling harder against the hands holding my arms and face captive. As I fought, the person rolled our bodies to the side, settling on top of my back and shoving my face into the dirt. The weight of the body held me down, pulling the breath from my lungs. I worked harder to breathe now, my body focusing on the need for oxygen that it wasn't finding on the ground. A voice suddenly whispered harshly into my ear. "Shut up and stay still." At the noise, my body went limp. I knew that voice. I tried to twist my head to confirm my suspicions, but a hand went to my neck, shoving my face further into the earth. The next moment I heard countless footsteps coming closer to me. My eyes widened and I searched for a place to conceal my body before I realized I was already hidden. Thick bushels of leaves and moss surrounded mine and my assailants' bodies, protecting every part of us from view. My breathing quickened as the noises of those chasing me came closer. My mind raced with the option of letting them find me or staying with whoever held me bound. My inner battle didn't slow the world down, however, and the decision was made for me. The footsteps were upon us now, and the person on top of me sprawled across my body, knocking any remaining air from me. I half expected those chasing me to stop where I disappeared, noticing my obvious absence ahead of them, but they kept moving. They kept running in the direction I'd been going, cursing at each other as they went. Eventually, their footsteps faded and I was left only with myself, the bushes, and my new captor. The minutes went by painfully slow as we both listened for the others to come back. With each passing moment, the person on top of me slowly peeled away. It was slight at first, allowing me to only bring my face out of the mud. But when it was clear they weren't coming our way again, the person sat lightly on my legs. I stayed frozen in place as my arms were eventually released as well, too afraid to turn around. My captor didn't bother moving either. But eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly turned my head, though I knew what I was going to see before my eyes fell upon him. Samuel. His eyes were a bright ruby color, mixing with every emotion known to man. Each second held a new look, a new glare, a new demand. I stared at them terrified. He stared straight back at me, holding me in a gaze that seemed it would never end. It seemed he was fighting something back, and I knew all too well what that something was. How I began but was quickly cut off. The moment I opened my mouth to speak, Samuel started diminishing the distance between us. He raised his arms and twisted my body, pulling my face next to his. I was kneeling before him now, completely at his mercy. As if he knew this, he closed the remaining distance and crashed his lips upon mine. I immediately froze at his assault. My mind couldn't keep up with what was happening to my body as he moved his lips roughly against mine, demanding attention. By the time my thinking caught up, he had stopped the attack and buried his face in my neck. His arms wrapped around my torso as he pulled me even closer. My breathing stopped. My heart followed. I'm pretty sure if he hadn't been holding me, I would have died right then and there. My mind was the only thing alive and it was screaming at me for what just happened. I thought you were dead, he whispered into my neck. I didn't even try to respond, as too many words were racing through my mind. As if Samuel knew this, he reluctantly let me go, breathing heavily as he did so. I finally realized he no longer had me pinned up against him, and in the next moment I was flying to my feet. He followed suit, however, glancing warily around us before watching me carefully. We need to get going, he spoke louder now. I turned to face him, preparing to scream in his face. However, as soon as I looked at him, the words left my brain once again. He was standing before me in nothing but an old pair of shorts. He didn't have shoes, a jacket, or even a shirt. His bare chest seemed to scream. My eyes lingered there for just a moment before I raised them to his face. I expected to see rage, ferocity, and a desire to rip my heart out. However, his face was the complete opposite of my expectations. His dark eyes were back and they were almost gentle, though the longer I stared I could see a hint of anger bubbling beneath the surface. Quickly turning away from him, I gathered my thoughts. I'm not going anywhere with you. I began to sprint away from him, but he quickly grabbed my broken wrist, sending painful spasms up my arm. The day at the beach played through my mind, reminding me of how easy it was for him to prevent me from leaving him. The past few days of freedom suddenly seemed as a faraway and impossible dream. I held back a sob as my body swung back around, facing him once more. His anger wasn't beneath the surface anymore, but rising with each act of my insolence. Do you want to get caught? He growled at me, ruby flashing into his eyes. I looked straight at those eyes, spitting my words. I already have. He tensed and started his retort, but he was quickly cut off by a sound in the distance. We need to go now. I continued to fight against him, pulling my wrist back to my body. He didn't let go, however, and only came close to me, taking the chance to grab my other arm. Before I knew what was happening, he had me thrown onto his back. I started to protest, but the sound of countless people barreling through the forest now held my attention. Samuel swore under his breath as a man suddenly appeared ahead of us. He came running toward us, a long knife shining brightly in his hand. Samuel quickly propelled us forward, easily dodging the man and his weapon. I held on tightly to his shoulders, more willing to stay with him than meet the stranger holding a knife. We flew through the forest at an inhuman speed. I closed my eyes as various leaves and bits of dirt flew into my face as we dove through bushes rather than around. Samuel's pace was rough and ragged. A loud and feral growl suddenly ripped from his chest, which sent my eyes flinging back open. Various objects were being thrown from ahead of us, and he was desperately trying to maneuver around each one while holding me steadily on his back. However, he wasn't so lucky. Just as he ducked to the right, a short dagger came flying through the air and lodged itself in Samuel's arm. His pace faltered, allowing another identical knife to land next to the first. The injured arm fell dead to his side, half of my body following suit. Samuel stumbled in this shift of weight, his legs failing him as another knife grazed his thigh. We stumbled over each other, the weapons only digging further into his flesh as he tumbled into the dirt. When we finally stopped moving, Samuel was hovering over my body, blood pouring from his wounds. He didn't act as though he cared, though I stared in horror as the dark liquid pooled around me, seeming to glimmer against his skin. My eyes darted around us as I heard multiple people shouting, coming closer. Before I could move, at least 6 men came upon us, each holding several daggers. The weapons each varied in size and length, but they were identical in color and material. As I studied them, suddenly everything about Samuel's wounds made sense. Silver was etched into every single one. Samuel let out a loud and threatening growl as they came closer. He stood, making me follow his lead. His good arm wrapped around my side, pushing me behind him. I watched as the men continued to advance upon us. I studied each of them, quickly realizing I recognized Zane and Enzo in their midst. They were breathing heavily, eyes darting between Samuel and me. Come any closer and you're all dead, Samuel suddenly spat. The men paused, though it didn't seem as if they were afraid of the half-human standing before them. Zane suddenly sneered. The look was so foreign compared to what I'd seen, and I took an involuntary step back. Samuel pulled me closer to him though, not allowing me to move another inch. You're outmatched and outnumbered, Wolf. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. Samuel scoffed. He didn't bother to respond, but his body started to shake. Bones started cracking, allowing wolf claws to suddenly appear on his hands. Just as he was about to lunge at the men and finish the shift, 2 shots rang through the air. Gunshots. I'd only heard stories of gunshots before. In the early days of James, my mother had told me about them. What they sounded like, smelled like, looked like. She'd wanted me prepared if I ever came into a situation with one, though it wasn't common. Wolves had taken every single one. As I stared in the area where the shots rang off, I realized every horrible thing she said was true. 2 more figures started emerging through the trees, the small black guns held high above each of their heads. I recognized each person, each woman. Their contrasting skin and hair made them look like night and day, but it was them nonetheless. To see them together sent another wave of emotion through my body. It only confirmed what I had been suspecting. Talia and Margaret. Another 2 shots rang through the air, and before I could register what was happening, Samuel was falling to the ground. I looked down in horror as more blood started pooling around his feet, seeping from 2 fresh wounds in each of his legs. That's enough, Margaret's voice suddenly rang out. If you move again, the next shot is going in Samantha's head. I looked up in horror as Talia slowly raised her gun to me. My arms raised up, palms facing the small crowd before us. Stop, Samuel coughed out, managing half a growl. Don't you dare fucking touch her. We won't have to if you comply, Talia spoke up. Samuel stayed silent and my eyes darted from him to the women before us. The men were still there too, each shining blade glimmering in the fading sun. Pounding seconds of silence stretched between us all as we waited on Samuel to make a move. When he stayed still, Margaret finished the ordeal. Tie them up. The men inched forward, each reaching into bags Talia threw their way. Deliberately, almost carefully, they took the rope from the duffels and advanced towards Samuel and I. Talia came with them, walking straight up to me. One wrong move and she's dead, she glowered at Samuel. I shrunk back at her expression. Much like Zane's, it was foreign and seemed wrong against her seemingly innocent features. Samuel raised his gaze and glared back, a low noise coming from his chest. However, he stayed completely still, glancing to the gun trained on my temple. Talia stood by my side, and I mimicked Samuel's stillness, very much aware of the cold hardness pressed into my head. I didn't think I could move if I wanted to. I was still in my initial position, my feet rooted to the ground and arms raised in surrender. My eyes were the only thing that moved, following each of the men as they continued their advances. The men were next to Samuel now, and as they pushed him to his knees and started tying his hands, I noticed silver lacing through the material of the rope. As soon as I noticed this, I heard Samuel breathe in suddenly, closing his eyes. I looked to where they bound his hands, watching the skin slowly burn. My gaze turned to one of horror as the men continued to wrap the poisonous material around Samuel's torso. Without a shirt, his skin was completely exposed. It morphed around the thick rope, blisters popping up almost instantly. "What are you doing?" I cried. Desperately, I glanced to each of the people I recognized in the group. There had to be some sort of humanity in their souls, something that told them this was wrong. However, they each held stone-cold and hateful glares, their eyes trained on Samuel. I waited for them to answer me, but a sound never left their lips. "Please tell me what's going on." Margaret snapped her gaze to me as Talia shifted the gun against my head. Zane and Enzo busied themselves with Samuel, never once looking my way. "Samantha, you need to shut up or we will make you," Margaret voiced. My eyes widened at the threat. Confusion mixed through my brain as I watched the supposed good guys inflict pain on Samuel. Endless amounts of rope were being placed around his entire torso. His breathing was ragged now, the silver clearly taking its toll. When it seemed there wasn't an inch left of his body to cover, the men turned to me. Samuel whipped his eyes open and screamed. His voice was desperate and filled with pain. The men ignored him and roughly brought my hands forward, binding my wrists in the same rope as they had Samuel. He suddenly started thrashing beside me, and I shot a horrified glance his way when Talia shifted the gun, clicking something into place. The sound and my terrified expression were all he needed to go ghostly still. He stared in horror at a place next to my head. I desperately wanted to look there and move away from Talia, from the men, from Margaret, but I couldn't move an inch. Not without dying. Samantha, you're going to be okay. You're going to be fine, Samuel spoke in a frenzy. His voice was distressed, which did nothing to ease my fears. He knew what trouble we were in, and it was slowly dawning on me as well. I slowly nodded my head, a single tear escaping my eye. I quickly shut them as the men continued to tie my wrists, wrapping the last of the rope. When the job was done, they retreated and pulled out their weapons once more. I felt the cold barrel on my temple shift to my neck and push me forward. Move, Talia demanded. I complied and stumbled forward, watching as Zane and Enzo lifted Samuel to his feet. A dagger was held to his neck by one of them while the other held a shorter knife to his back. Samuel watched as I walked forward, only moving when pushed forward with the tips of the sharp blades. My head went to turn back to watch him, but Talia trained the gun on the back of it to prevent the movement. I choked back a sob as I felt the hardness push my hair aside and rest on the vulnerable skin of my skull. As we began walking, I tried to get my bearings. When I'd ran from the safe house, I didn't care which direction I went. When I'd run off the path, I didn't care either. It was only now when I was tied up and being pushed forward by a gun that I decided I should look around. And of course I didn't recognize a thing. However, I did know something. These people would only take us further into the forest where we would likely be killed. Chapter 16 One of Us Part 1 My suspicions were correct. The group of men and women led Samuel and me further into the forest, the trees around us growing thicker with every step. The sun was completely gone now, and Margaret had pulled out a flashlight to lead the way. The artificial light sent eerie shadows across our group as the last rays of sun faded away. As we walked, I couldn't help the glares I sent in Margaret's direction, as well as the feelings of hatred for her and those behind me. Almost all of the people I'd met and trusted were somehow here, dragging me through the forest. Margaret, Zane, Talia, Enzo, these people were supposed to help, not tie me up and hold a gun to my head. My glares did nothing to stop them though, and we trudged on deeper and deeper into the never-ending maze of trees. Before long, I started to notice something flickering ahead. We walked directly towards the motion, almost letting it guide us. Accompanying the sparking shadows was a faint orange glow that seemed to mock the appearance of a sunset. As we advanced, my eyes fell upon a raging fire in the middle of a large clearing. Margaret turned off her flashlight as we approached, the fire giving us all the light we needed. I was continually shoved forward by Talia as we entered the clearing. I quickly noticed a stone building to the right of us, nearly identical to the one I'd stayed in earlier that day. The only difference being it was larger, much larger. People were pouring out of it, walking towards the fire in small groups. I lost count of them as my head was shoved to the ground, preventing me from examining anything further. Our group made our way to the fire where I was pushed to the ground, falling on my knees. The barrel of the gun finally left my head and I quickly turned to find Samuel. The men were dragging him behind us, moving until they came next to me. They threw him on the ground where he landed in a heap. He tried to lift himself up but only fell further into the dirt. I scanned him once over, gasping when I saw the blood staining almost every inch of the rope that held him bound. The skin was hardly there anymore, and the men hadn't bothered to take out the knives lodged into his arm. When my eyes fell upon his extended legs, I realized the cause for him not walking. 2 large holes rested in each leg, something large and silver glinting from within the skin. Apparently silver bullets were a thing now. His wretched and unmoving figure drew me towards him, my instincts screaming at me to somehow help him. Before I could move though, 2 arms quickly wrapped around my elbows. I looked behind me only to see an expressionless Zane holding me captive. I fought against his grip, but he only tightened it. My ears registered people murmuring and I quickly glanced around us. A large crowd was now gathered around the fire, each and every person looking straight at Samuel and I. The crowd consisted of men, women, and even children. They all had a knowing look in their eyes, though some seemed to hold a glint of fear as well. Their fear aimed towards Samuel and me only fueled my own. "What's going on?" I screamed desperately, my voice coming out much stronger than I felt. Margaret appeared in front of me, suddenly slapping me hard. My face fell to the side with the movement, her hand leaving a burning sensation in place. Samuel snarled loudly, causing a few people to suddenly move away from us. Margaret didn't move, however, keeping her place directly in front of me. She appeared as if she was going to scream in my face before a woman suddenly appeared next to her, placing a long hand on Margaret's shoulder. Margaret relaxed slightly, looking up at the new woman's tall frame. She had short white hair that fell to her shoulders in a plain and straight line. It seemed to ripple with every move she made. Slight wrinkles lined her eyes, a particularly deep one embedding itself in between her brows. As she emerged, people unknowingly seemed to look to her for answers. "What do you want?" Samuel suddenly growled next to me. I looked at him, noticing he was staring at the white-haired woman with recognition. She smiled, cooing, "What we will soon get. Like hell." At his words, the woman quickly raised her hand and made a brushing motion towards Samuel. Men immediately grabbed him, holding tightly onto the knives embedded in his flesh. Something flashed in his eyes and I suddenly realized Samuel wasn't as hurt as he'd made it seem. He instantly began to fight the men off, sending a few flying dangerously close to the fire. At his actions, I was quickly snatched to my feet and brought in between Margaret and the older woman. Once again I felt something hard press against my flesh, though this time it was held to my side. "Stop fighting, Wolf," the woman called. Samuel ignored her and started to rip through the rope that held him bound. I watched a few of the strands fall to his sides as he raised his fists high. Men slowly started backing away as Samuel's back arched, sending a sickening cracking noise through the air. A woman screamed somewhere and I noticed several people rushing away from the scene, back into the large house. "If you don't stop, we will have to shoot her," the woman spoke again. Panic coursed through me at her words, the gun suddenly feeling as if it was already cutting through my flesh. However, once the men started rushing Samuel once again, he crouched low to the ground. A newfound strength came into his being as he fought them off, lashing out wildly and finally breaking the last of the rope that held him bound. When no more men came forward, he sneered at the older woman. "I know about you and your little cause. You wouldn't kill one of your own." The woman sighed, motioning something to Margaret. "Sadly, she is not one of us." The next few moments happened slowly, then all at once. Margaret stiffened beside me. Something clicked into place. A booming noise deafened my ears. Then pain. More screaming rang through my ears, but this time I realized they were my own. I fell forward and gripped my ribs, my side suddenly feeling as if 100 burning coals were poured over my skin. No one caught me as my body fell limply to the ground, my limbs folding in and around myself. I heard someone screaming my name, but I couldn't register who it was. All I could think was that I was going to die. This was it, and I was never going to make it out. I closed my eyes as black spots danced before my vision. Before I could welcome the darkness, someone was pulling at my face, lightly smacking my cheeks. My eyes shot open at the new sensation as it distracted me from my side for just a moment. I searched my surroundings until my gaze fell on Samuel, who was now directly in front of me. His lips were moving, his face contorted in complete agony. It slowly dawned that he was the one calling my name again and again. He was suddenly ripped from my vision as I felt myself being lifted into the air. I was placed on my feet, though the person holding me supported most of my weight. I slowly lifted my head up, expecting to see Samuel, but it was Margaret that had lifted me off the floor. Confusion poured into me until I saw Samuel placed in front of me, 4 men holding him down on his knees. Slowly, I noticed my senses were coming back to me, along with the pain growing in my side. Samuel was screaming at the white-haired woman as she adjusted her gray shirt and walked towards him. "Let her go. This doesn't concern her. Unless you want the next bullet lodged in her chest, I'd suggest you stay quiet," she spoke monotonously, leaning down to stare in his face. Samuel's chest was quickly rising and falling, puffing out slightly. He shot daggers into the woman's eyes. I tried to watch their encounter without interruption, but all too soon the burning sensation had grown too much to bear. Even with Margaret's strong arms holding me in place, I could hardly stand. My hands were plastered to my side attempting to ease the pain, but they did nothing to help. They only grew wet with what I assumed to be blood running down my body. "What do you want?" Samuel growled. I could hear the smile in the woman's voice as she responded. "Compliance." I felt Samuel's gaze on me once more. I tried to appear strong, tried not to show how much the wound was affecting me. The last thing I wanted was another one of his erupting fits of rage. Stop her bleeding and I will do what you say, Samuel spoke lowly. Just don't hurt her. That sounds like a reasonable request. But first we need you out of the way. Before I knew it, Samuel was being lifted off the ground and pushed forward. The group of men led him around the fire, walking directly by where I half stood. I lifted my gaze to meet Samuel's eyes, but quickly wished I hadn't. They were a flaming red, staring directly into my soul. His face was contorted into worry, his eyes darting constantly to my side. When he was finally out of my sight, I let my gaze down to where he'd been staring. I gasped as I saw the red liquid quickly flowing between my fingers. My breathing quickened and my body tensed. Though I knew it was no time for them, flashbacks of my time with James flew across my mind. This was the same kind of pain. I thought if I escaped him I wouldn't have to experience it again. I wouldn't gain any more scars. Clearly I was wrong. There was no escape. My gaze followed Samuel and the men holding him. They were heading for a spot on the ground that stood out from the rest of the camp, though only a little ways away from the fire and where I now stood. The ground seemed to glisten as the men moved tarps aside, revealing several long silver bars. At this sight Samuel froze. Margaret tightened her grip on me as the others struggled to push Samuel forward. As they fought, Margaret pushed me forward. I stumbled with the sudden movement, my feet flying out from underneath me. No hands caught me as I fell forward, my shoulder landing painfully on the ground, followed by the rest of my body. I cried out as the burning intensified and now seemed to cover my entire torso. At my cry, Samuel whirled around and began to tear away from his guards. He broke free for a fraction of a second and dove towards my limp body, but before he could help me he was ripped backward by another 3 men. He fought against them desperately, constantly looking back to me. The woman from before came and pulled me to my knees. My legs struggled to hold my weight and I felt as if I'd be content to die right then and there. The woman called out a few words, but my ears once again didn't comprehend what she was saying. However, I did notice Samuel go rigidly still, allowing the men to shove him closer to the silver bars. I watched them stalk towards the metal, malice lacing their stances. Just as I thought the men would tie Samuel up to burn alive, the bars suddenly opened. They popped upwards like a door, revealing a dark hole underneath. Samuel barely had time to register what was happening before he shot me one last horrified glance and was pushed into the hole. My gaze followed his body as it fell from view. I was still being held up by the woman and Margaret's strong grips. Without them, I knew I would collapse instantly. They seemed to know this as well but made no move to pull away. Instead, they moved me back until I stood in front of the fire, the crowd of people staring at me once more. I stared back, though not out of hostility this time. They were human and they knew I was human too. Surely that had to count for something. Surely they had to realize that I'd just been shot, and I needed help. Surely they wouldn't let me die. Surely now that they had Samuel they would let me go. However, my silent pleas were ignored. The eyes just stared back at me as if I was some foreign object they suddenly had the chance to explore. I was suddenly just some strange and new thing that they didn't know what to do with. Margaret's voice suddenly called out to someone, and I looked around to see movement in the crowd, while people parted to let someone through. My eyes slowly scanned the faces, trying to find who it was they were parting for. When a familiar face came into view though, a new hatred filled my being. As the shape of a man appeared, I used the last of my strength to glare directly into his eyes. This was the person I trusted. This was the person I thought would help me. This was the man who broke down my guard, allowing me to reveal information I wanted to stay hidden. This was the man I could thank for my betrayal. Cade. He met my gaze, looking down at me as he made his way to the front. Our eyes never left each other as he moved forward, coming slowly to stand in front of me. The hatred in my eyes didn't cease. Finally, he broke our eye contact and looked down at the ground. He hesitated slightly before he knelt down and brought something forward, placing it next to him. The grips on my elbows suddenly left and I faltered in place. My feet wanted to give out, but I wouldn't let them. I wouldn't show weakness. Cade, however, saw past my facade. He motioned to someone and Margaret suddenly appeared in my vision once more as she swiftly pushed me to my knees. I expected her to leave, but she kept a firm hand on my shoulder as Cade fiddled with what was next to him. Just stop the bleeding, Cade, Margaret voiced. He sighed. I need to see if the bullet is still in there. If it is, I have to pull it out. I flinched as he brought his hands forward, slowly removing mine from my side. My hands didn't want to comply, as I knew that as soon as they left their position an entirely new wave of pain would hit. Cade, however, was relentless. He pulled my arms away, ignoring my slew of curses directed at him. He ignored me as he peeled away the layers of clothing now matted to my skin with blood. I closed my eyes as the night's breeze hit my bare skin, sending it aflame once more. The bullet just grazed her. I'll wrap it and hopefully the bleeding will stop, Cade sighed. Before I could register his words, a new figure was appearing in my vision. I recognized the white-haired woman immediately. Thank you, Cade. I don't know what we'd do without your help. Cade grumbled something in response, my ears not quite catching what he said. My eyes followed his movements as he brought forth gauze and large bandages. Before I could register what he was doing, he began dabbing at my skin with something, sending entirely new waves of agony over me. I let out an involuntary gasp as he plastered countless things over my wound, expertly wrapping the gauze to allow it to stay in place. When he was finally finished, my breathing was ragged and harsh. Has it stopped? The woman's voice sounded. Cade sighed, looking to her and Margaret. For now. Margaret suddenly released her hold on me and walked away, forcing me to stand. I stumbled with the sudden action, but Cade quickly jumped up to steady me. Once I had my footing, I looked for the woman. She was standing right next to Margaret, the pair looking quite triumphant. Is someone going to tell me what the hell is going on? My voice suddenly sounded. It was full of venom and unheard screams. Margaret scrunched her face in disgust while the woman simply smiled. Cade, why don't you inform Samantha, as she put it, what the hell is going on? Cade groaned, almost too quiet for me to hear. Samantha, he started, turning towards me, his voice completely different from before. There was no humor, no childlike laughter. We've got to put you down there with the wolf. Either you go willingly or forced. I let his words sink in for a moment before I completely lost it. Are you kidding me? I practically screamed in his face. I went to continue, but he quickly cut me off. Listen, Samantha. No, you listen, Cade, I quickly retorted. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm sure as hell not going to be put in a hole and left to die. I was just shot, for fuck's sake. You people were supposed to help me get out of here, not literally throw me to the wolves. I breathed heavily in between rants, realizing I now had the attention of every person in the clearing. Normally I would shy away from something like this, but tonight it only fueled my desperate fire. I'm a human, remember? What threat could I possibly pose? Just let me go and I swear I won't look back. This will be over, I cried out. I was calling out to the sympathies of the onlookers, hoping to gain some sort of compassion. While shouting, I let my eyes rest on Margaret and the woman standing next to her. My eyes narrowed slightly when I saw their smug grins, immediately realizing this was doing me no good. I turned my attention back to Cade, knowing I'd clearly lost the fight. I fucking trusted you. He sighed. I thought that if you got out of town it'd be okay. I never imagined your mate would be the beta. He paused, finally looking me in the eye. You're with the wolves now. Silence ensued as I let his statement sink in. I'm not his fucking mate, I eventually responded. I'm a human, no matter what you people keep telling yourselves. I am no different from you. I wish that were true, he told me softly. Cade broke his resolve. He looked down to the ground, hair falling over his features. I saw his shoulders rising and falling quickly, and I prayed he'd take pity on me. He was the one who got me into this, and he might be my last hope in getting out. All I wanted was to get away so I could help my family. My voice broke, betrayal tears forming in my eyes. Please just let me go. He hesitated before responding. Samantha, The woman from before suddenly cleared her throat. I whipped my gaze towards her, not bothering to wipe the tears that were now cascading down my cheeks. She ignored me and walked forward to stand next to Cade, placing a hand on his shoulder. Cade, she spoke kindly. That's enough. At her words, Cade stiffened and stood up. Without another glance my way, he turned and walked back into the crowd. Coward! I screamed as I watched him leave, sending daggers into his back. I hoped he felt every one. Samantha, that's enough, she started. I whipped my head to face this new woman. Who the hell are you? Damaria born, she smiled proudly, though I noticed it didn't go past her lips. Is that supposed to mean something? Her smile disappeared. I was originally the one who deemed you acceptable to help our cause. Seems I've misjudged. She waved a hand to some men and they emerged, started to force me forward once again. I struggled within their iron grasps, crying out in pain. What is that supposed to mean? What do you want with me? I cried desperately. My resolve was weakening and I realized I would do anything to not be thrown into that hole. Please, I just want to leave. Let me go. She smiled. My pleading cries only got louder as the men picked me up by my elbows and began leading me to the hole. Ignoring the pain coursing through my entire body, I dug my heels into the ground and fought desperately. It did no good. With each second we got closer to the darkness. There's no point in struggling, Samantha. We've won. The woman's voice rang out once more. I stopped my struggles for just a second as I looked her square in the eyes. Burn in hell. Her face darkened and the men pulled me harder. I was brought to the edge of the hole in the ground, where the men paused momentarily. My limbs thrashed wildly, trying to catch onto something that would pull me away from my assailants. The woman's voice pierced the night for the last time. Throw her in. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.